Awesome. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Pauline. So the next workshop we have, the last workshop for tonight is resource auditing for your FRC team with a good friend of ours, Kellen Hill from team 1746 in Georgia. So thank you so much, Kellen, for doing this, and feel free to take it away.
Hey, howdy, everybody. Glad to be here. Go ahead and get my presentation pulled up here. Oops. All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Kellen Hill. I'm a mentor for Team 1746, Team Auto, out of Cumming, Georgia. I'll be presenting tonight on resource auditing for your FRC team. I'm located over on the East Coast, so I'm at about 9 p.m. right now. But I guess we got people all over the country, maybe the world. So welcome to the presentation. A little bit about me. I'm actually I'll go through my FRC experience and then do a little bit more about me. But I was a student on Team 1625 up in Winnebago, Illinois, from 2005 to 2007. After that, I was a mentor on Team 525. So this was just after I graduated college. I moved to Cedar Falls, Iowa for a year. So I looked up my local team and joined up with the Swart Dogs. And after that, I wound up moving down to Georgia, looking up again local team, and wound up getting hitched up with Team 1746 all the way back in 2013. So I've been with the team for, I guess, 8 seasons now, and it's been quite a ride. But I'll tie in some kind of thoughts and ideas on those experiences. But on the topic of resource auditing, and we'll get into a bit more of the topic in the next slide. But as a student, as a mentor, as a lead mentor, you gain quite a bit of experience being around a variety of teams. You get the variety of then the resources those teams have at their disposal. If you're on them for any substantial amount of time, you get to see how they go about developing those resources. As a student, one of my and I'm sure other people on Winnovation as students realized this as we were competing. But back in the day, we were competing at the Midwest Regional or the St. Louis Regional, and commonly coming up against teams like Wild Stang or Beatty Beast or Bomb Squad, or Symbotics would come in town every now and then, same with Thunder Chickens. But these were teams we were looking at, and we were working out of a non-heated shop in the winter in Illinois with some resources, obviously, but we'd show up at our events, but we'd see these near professionally designed robots at events for these beautiful robots, and we're like, how are we supposed to compete with these guys? So that kind of started the ball rolling. But the questions we'd ask ourselves on the team back then was, what do we have to do better next time to compete with and play with those guys? So that's kind of one of the driving concepts behind this presentation and behind why developing resources for your team is such an important area to focus on. So what is resource auditing? First off, auditing is such an awesome word. I know a lot of people, especially once you get into the professional world, are really excited about that word. But in this case, it's really just having an honest conversation about your team's existing resources to say, again, what do we do, or what have we done right? What have we done wrong? How do we do it better next time? So you're sitting down and being honest with yourself about what your current strengths are, what your weaknesses are. Some people, I'm sure this has some breadth to it, but you might be familiar with a SWOT analysis, SWOT, for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. But this is a key area here. You have to be really honest with yourself about what your existing resources are, because if you're not honest about it, it's hard to really identify any team weaknesses that might require some attention. And again, resource auditing is a little bit used for identifying then what resources need the most development to help your team reach its goals, which is what we'll get to here in this next slide. So why are we talking about resources? It's such a huge part the FRC puzzle. There's no one singular team, one singular thing a team can do, because it's so easy to, again, look at the robots I was talking about. You'll see a lot of other great looking robots when you get out to competitions, but it's easy to just see those teams and those programs and say, how are we supposed to get from where I am to there? But resources are a big piece of that puzzle. It's again not a fix-all. One of the most important things about for mentioning here is knowing how to use your resources. So a couple of these next bullet points are going to hint at some existing presentations, which I'll link at the end of this PowerPoint. But this topic really stands on the shoulders of giants in the sense that I couldn't be talking about this if I hadn't watched Karthik's presentations on effective first strategies and strategic design, or goal setting. Michael Corsetto has done and again, I have a linked presentation at the end of this. He's done on how your team should go about setting goals. Those are two of the other most complementary topics you can link to this. Again, I couldn't be talking about this if it wasn't for those two topics. So this is really a complementary presentation to be giving. So make sure you're checking out those presentations that I've linked at the end, because again, it's a piece of the puzzle and they all work together. So yeah, strategic design is discussing how to best utilize your resources to get to the best possible outcome. So that's where your resources and input, as others talk about. But maximizing your resources kind of allows for the most possibilities once you get to that point. And again, knowing how to use your resources is something that's going to help your team kind of extend your ceiling or push your ceiling up. But so next up, then goal setting focuses on your team, on deciding your team's direction. So if your team doesn't know where it wants to go, it's hard to figure out how to get there. And building and developing your resources is really one of the main ways of pursuing your team's goals. Like if you set the goal of pursuing Chairman's Award, you really want to develop resources like let's see, you're talking about people for community contacts. How many community contacts do you have? Do you have a developed awards team on your robot? Do you have mentors that can help guide that process? Do you have funds for the organizational effort to be able to coordinate as a team to attack those goals? So yeah, determining where your goals are is one part of the process. Building and developing the resources to be able to go after those goals is then a huge part of that process. All right, so your team's resources have a significant impact on any particular strategy or design you might want to use. So it's a bit of a cyclical process, is that at the same time, so if you want to set goals, you have to be in mind mindful of what existing resources you have. So you don't want to set goals that overextend your capabilities or the resources you currently have available, but you want to set goals that force you to reach at least a little bit. So get a little bit out of your comfort zone, but not so much that you're going to overextend your team's capabilities or current resource set. But part of that is in setting those goals, you can say, all right, we have some idea of how to get around that or how to develop resources to be able to pull that off. So if you're looking at a new robot design, or you have a student that's really curious about designing a sheet metal chassis, yeah, you're talking about then going out and finding a sheet metal manufacturer nearby. But those finding a sheet metal manufacturer, it takes time. You can't. It's a tricky position. Like if you're at the beginning of build season and you say, "Oh, I just decided I want to do a sheet metal drivetrain this year." So getting those kind of resources built and developed while there's time to do so is important. But obviously you have to, again, with it being cyclical, your resources both have an impact on where your goals are, but also kind of, or your goals then are at the same time pushing the effort you're putting into developing your resources. So it's one feeds the other kind of thing. But the line I've used is wherever you set your goals, make sure you have to reach a little bit to get them, and continuously developing your resources is one of the ways to do that. Why should you audit your resources? So again, I was talking a little bit about it. They're setting the ceiling for your team. So I'll get a little bit into different types of resources in a little bit, which some might be more obvious than others, but depending on the amount of time you have, which it's somewhat in some senses set by FIRST on the amount of time you get access to your robot, or part of that's how much access you have to your school, part of it's how much money you have to spend on. So the more resources you develop, and again, the key component here is knowing how to use them, the more you can extend your team ceiling in a variety of senses. Some of this applies to both like competing with a robot as well as functioning as a team in general. Again, for pursuing outreach programs and things like that you have to develop resources there as well. Second bullet point, and this is crucial, this is just as much about maintaining existing resources as it is developing new ones. So when you're talking about existing resources your team has, make sure you're saying thank you and appreciating existing resources, whether those resources be sponsors that are providing either money or in-kind donations. You're talking about mentors or your teachers that are helping you to pull off everything an FRC team does. You're talking about the parents on the team that might be bringing food in. So make sure you're taking care of the things you have before worrying too much about developing new resources. And there's something to be said here. There's a lot to be said for like the general forward movement of an FRC team, that you can see teams that are sorry about that, that are kind of continuously progressing, that they have some continuity, they're always getting better from year to year. But there are teams that are in situations that don't have the ability to access a not access, but are on shaky, or on a team with shaky resources. So you're talking about teams that have teachers that aren't all that accessible, that don't really give you much time to meet. So in those situations, you got to play a little bit differently. Again, it's about kind of maintaining existing resources and pulling off what you're capable of and building on that incrementally, but make sure you take care of what you got before you worry about growing upon it. So again, so some other instances of why it's important to audit your resources or kind of check your resources. I got a list of examples here. We'll go through, talk about a couple of them, but it's somewhat straightforward and why you might want to check your resources or figure out which ones to better develop. So we're talking about not having time to finish your intended robot. One of the resources so many people don't give its due is the amount of time you get. Especially like this last season where you don't have to worry about bagging your robot. They're like, oh, more time. But it's so hard to let time get away from you. Make sure you're making schedules, making sure you're giving proper time to each sub team on the team to get their part done. I know here at 1746, we always put our programmers on the hot seat because we'll take our sweet time on getting the physical robot done. But yeah, parts on the robot keep breaking. So you might have some like design inexperience for knowing how to design the right part. So you might need to develop some better design skills, or if you're not having the right materials available to you, you might need to do a bit more fundraising to get stronger materials. no spare parts for when your robot breaks. Again, you're talking about just having the resources, again, for parts, money, in-kind sponsors to be able to have things on hand to replace those. That's also an organizational issue, is making sure you're setting aside the time to prepare for packing out for an event. Poor decision making lead to lost matches. And again, I'm kind of jumping around a little bit here, so sorry about that. But that might lead to your resource of how much time and effort are you putting into your strategy team are you running willy-nilly from match to match? Or do you have a set aside crew that's focusing on preparing your drive team for each match to utilize the correct strategy? So again, you're talking about resources. Again, there's a lot of time in it, but developing your analytical skills, your depth of game knowledge. I know there are plenty of drive coaches out there that'll pull out. They'll be like, hey, remember when we pulled off this trick however many years ago? We're going to try that same thing here. That kind of experience and that depth of knowledge is an excellent resource for making sure your team's making the right decisions. So make sure you're putting in the time and effort to make the right decisions in the right situation. Driver training is another heavily time-related issue, but it can also be linked to money and like manufacturing skills, in that you might develop a practice robot. So your programmers can work on one robot over here while your drive team gets their hands on the robot. So again, you're talking about resources. Being able to put together a second robot, again, talking about extending your team ceiling to allow your teams to be more competitive. Yeah, I won't go through that entire list just because it's extensive, but that's just a handful of examples. This is a bit of a quick case study. I'm sure there are plenty of teams out there that have either similar stories, but this is one of the more immediate ones for me, just because I was on the team from left to right here. So the robot you're seeing on your left is our Team 1746's 2013 robot. So when I first joined the team, it was January 3rd of 2013. So I moved down to Georgia, and within a day or two, had joined the team. But this was essentially a rookie team in some sense. The 1746 started all the way back in 2006, was a rookie year, but had a bit of a bumpy history in some sense, in that it had a really good strong start, and then there were a couple points at which it jumped from one high school to another. And for 2013, that was again the case, where we had started at a brand new school. So we had a brand new set of students. We had a teacher that had had some FRC experience, and we had an awesome sponsor in Automation Direct. So if you look closely there, you can see some plenty of our design was heavily inspired by or heavily utilized in pneumatics. But I wanted to visualize this because we decided in 2013 that to make a robot based off of the resources we had available. So again, we heavily used the access to Automation Direct's parts catalog. But as you can see in there, we have the 2005 kit of parts chassis. It was one of the worst drivetrains I've ever seen, but it's it didn't really need to do much. It just sat under the pyramid, shot 3 frisbees and auton, and climbed the rest of the match. So we didn't really interact with other robots. It was a simple design in that we didn't have to do much. So we were utilizing our resources in that we didn't have an extensive. I might have had experience with FRC as well as the teacher and Rick Foley, who was another mentor at that time, but the students were brand new to it. So we weren't working with much institutional knowledge when we were coming up with the design and building that robot. So we were playing to the resources we had. But along the way, and this, if it isn't obvious, the robot on the right is the 2020 robot. So you're talking a period over 8 years. So this is not a snap your fingers and make it happen operation. This takes a lot of time and effort, and I'm sure there are teams that have made it happen a lot faster than that. But based off of our situation, our resources, our capacities, this is what we've been able to pull off, and I'm pretty jazzed about it myself. But what some of the differences are from left to right, and a lot of these a handful of them are visual on the robot. You can see things like obviously design skill is one of those things. We started developing a substantial amount of depth for the design skill we had on the team. As students learned, as they became alumni, as they came back to help mentor the team. Obviously, you get that 4-year turnover for students for being able to kind of stack up that skill level as they go. But along the way, we also stacked up a fair amount of mentor capacity for attracting some awesome mentors from places like Georgia Tech. Again, Automation Direct has been a fantastic supporter for parts as well as mentors. And those people then kind of, once we got the ball rolling, it was a bit contagious. Sorry for hinting at any current global situation, but that those people then got excited enough about this thing that they started inviting their friends. So that we're fortunate in that resource helped develop itself. But some other things along the way, we decided, like I mentioned earlier, we decided sheet metal was something we wanted to work with. And I think this took about 1.5 years to actually happen, because I think we contacted the sheet metal company that was local, and all we did was Google sheet metal fabrication or manufacturing in Google, and saw what some local options were for it. And luckily for us, there were some local options. Obviously, depends what area you're in. We're pretty close to Atlanta, so there's a well-developed manufacturing community. But if you're in a more rural location, you might have a few less immediately available resources. But we wound up sending an email. The email wasn't checked due to how busy the contact was, but I think it was then before the 2016 season we were able to get in touch, and that's when we built and developed our first sheet metal oriented design, which worked out incredibly well. But again, there were a lot of baby steps in the design, building up the design resources that were associated with being able to pull off sheet metal design. So it was very rudimentary to start with, but some things you'd be able to see on the robot on your right are some, we developed a bit of a fixation on 1/48 designs, which is a huge part of our sheet metal design. So we're again developing that skill set by extending that institutional knowledge or those design skills by checking out what other teams are doing. You can see some other neat features in there for like pocketing polycarb. But the other things that you don't see in this picture that really changed and allowed us to pull off this 2020 robot is the again, that excitement that our team was developing. We had a parent attend the 2015 champs with us that saw what his son was able to pull off on the, or contribute on the team, learn from the team. And he got so plugged in that he wound up developing a booster club for our team that allowed us to more easily handle team funds, make team purchases, handle team donations or sponsorships from local companies. That really extended our ability to perform as an organization. So you're talking about increasing the amount of money we'd be able to purchase robot parts with, instead of depending so heavily on a single sponsor. But that organization then, the Booster Club has then had hands in organizing team meals for getting parents involved. But that organization of the Booster Club then allowed us to more easily then feed team mentors, which again, we're like 45 minutes or to an hour and a half, depending on traffic, from like downtown Atlanta. But we had mentors coming out to help our team in Cumming, Georgia, because they were excited about this process and they were getting fed and they were getting shirts. So depending on how your team's structured, once you get that ball rolling, it's it wants to keep rolling, but obviously it needs people behind it pushing it. So that's where you're really focusing on that team leadership effort to, again, check your resources. How can we best develop those resources? And silly as it may sound, team meals and team shirts for your mentors might just be one of those ways to build that excitement around your team and develop some resources. So yeah, I just wanted to show this off as a kind of a cool transformation from where I started with Team Auto back in 2013 to where we're currently at, and how awesome it's been to kind of stand back every now and then and see the transformation that we've been able to pull off with this team. But by no means are we done. We're always looking to push that ceiling. So, all right, let's keep moving on here. So again, types of FRC resources, and I've mentioned some of these in some sense in previous slides, but make sure you give time respect. Again, it's something that gets abused frequently, but make sure you give it its due. When you're talking about students, you're talking about the talent, skill level, how many of them you have on your team. So you might need to do some recruitment. Recruitment's something you got to do every year, just because you might have a great team now, but what is it going to look like in 4 years when your current members are gone? So it's really important to share that excitement with new students and get them in the door, as well as focusing on training the new students. So keep them involved, because that's going to have some real important downstream effects on your team for years to come. Mentors are important. Students obviously have their 4-year turnover. So mentors can kind of create some staying power, but then you're also getting a breadth of information based on those mentors' background. So whether they're an industry professional or if they're just somebody who knows how to write grants, they're awesome folks to have around, and really, again, help extend that, continue to extend that ceiling. And you're also talking about here, I'll toss in with mentors, you're talking about your team's teachers, your team's, the parents on your teams. So make sure you're focusing on all those available resources. And I'll make a quick point here. See, I'm behind, I'm getting or not. But one point I had to make to our business team at some point, they were doing cold calls from a Chamber of Commerce cold business list that they had. And I had to point to the robot and pointed to the robot and said, where have 90% of those sponsors come from? And there was an immediate, like, 1 degree of separation between our team members or past team members and any of those sponsors. So instead of them just being gained from cold calling, you really want to emphasize utilizing the resources that are immediately in front of you. So make sure you're asking team parents where they work, that if their company should have a sponsorship program for local schools, local student programs. Make sure you're using, again, those resources that are right in front of you. We're talking about money. Obviously, that helps out in a variety of ways. Manufacturing capabilities, both in-house for the equipment you have at hand for 3D printers, or if you're talking like drill presses, X, Y, and Z, as well as then like I was saying, for any amount of manufacturing capabilities your community might have, to be able to approach and ask them to say, hey, I've got this thing we're working on. And this has been a crucial part of our success with gaining local manufacturing help, is approach them with a project in hand. So bring in an existing design saying, hey, here's how we're currently doing something, but we'd love some help or some insights from you on how we might be able to improve it. Or we know you have these capabilities. How can you help us out build this design? Team communication and organization, again, is such a crucial resource that, again, is not an immediate thing you think about, because a lot of teams see those beautiful robots when at competition. They're like, oh, we just need more money, or or a lathe or a CNC or something like that. But one of the biggest factors in that is being able to communicate properly as a team and be organized, so you can come ready and have a plan when it comes to attacking any specific goal your team puts in front of you. And institutional knowledge, this again factors into your students and mentors with that 4-year turnaround. And again, this is kind of where you're talking about specific design skills. So this is the reason teams will do mock kickoffs before a season starts, is they're developing that skill set. They're developing their team's know-how on how to go about approaching a new game. So instead of learning in the trenches by getting tossed into it week 1 of build season, you can get a head start by developing, again, that institutional knowledge. Sometimes this is hard to build without that real world experience, for going to a competition, getting your butt kicked, and figuring out how do we get better from here. Getting your butt kicked is a huge part of institutional knowledge. That it's one of the most inspiring things to figure out. All right, this is where we're capable of getting. How do we do it better next time? Because that's one of the things that is a heavy driver in developing that institutional knowledge, is losing some tough matches. But yeah, good experience to learn from. So when to audit your team's resources? This is, I guess, a funky question to ask in some sense. You have to, because again, with it being a piece of the puzzle, it's not as if you just talk about your resources and it's its own separate thing. It has to be so heavily built in with how your team does goal setting, when your team does goal setting. A habit we've developed on 1746 is whenever we come back from an event, we'll talk. We'll have a conversation for asking 3 important questions for what went right, what went wrong, how do we do it better next time. Sometimes those things have some emphasis on our resources, but generally this conversation can happen, or most influentially happen, I think, after the competition season ends, whether that's after your local regional, if that's as far as you get, or after your team's district events or district state champs or worlds, wherever your team winds up finishing the season. Just after it ends winds up being one of the best points to kind of reflect upon how your team was able to perform and what might have been the limitations or the things that most helped you succeed in those situations. So having that recent experience fresh in your mind is a good way to go about kind of visualizing what your team might need to do better next time, by having that kind of fresh experience in your mind. So right after competition season is what I'd recommend. And that also, at the same time of having that fresh memory and rolling, it also allows you to then have the most significant amount of time before the next competition season to go about building and developing those resources. And again, this happens hand in hand with goal setting. So depending on how your team does goal setting, you might set some goals immediately after the competition season starts to say, all right, what do we need to be doing during the off season? So you're talking about things like training students, attending things like beach blitz, whether it's in person or virtual, as awesome as this is. So right now, whether you believe it or not, you're developing your team's resources so whenever possible is the answer for when you should be developing your resources. Specifically auditing your team's resources. It's something you keep tabs on, but it can more so be tied specifically to an event at the end of the competition season, where you're again reviewing what resources you have and how to go about best developing them from where you're at. Let's see. Yeah, so I covered the rest of that. How to audit your resources. And this is, if I was working on it a little bit, and I'll see if I can't push out a resource after, or get a resource developed after this, and kind of hits on our fourth bullet point here for documentation, is putting together a bit of a worksheet for your team to be able to sit down and fill out to say, all right, for all of these various resource types, what existing resources do we have? What's the current state of them? Are they serving us well? Are we serving are we serving them well is an important one, for making, because so many of those relationships are reciprocal in that you need to take care of certain resources for them to continue helping out your team. But developing a worksheet for your team to be able to work through with a variety of different resource types. And again, just to make sure you're focusing on all of the different resource types instead of just the most immediate ones, because you may have lost a match because you didn't have the right autonomous mode. So you might most immediately point your fingers at like your programming team, but they may have not had enough time. So so again, back to the first bullet point, honesty is crucial. There's some knee-jerk situations I can imagine where your team like points a finger at a very specific resource, like this is the thing that held us back. This is why we didn't win. But it's important to take a bit of a step back and have an honest conversation about what really went wrong in that situation. Because rarely is it that it was simply a quick decision that happened in a certain situation. A lot of times it's preparedness. Again, talking about your team's like analytical decision-making skills, both as a drive team, as a strategy team, for making the right calls in the right situation. So make sure you're not just knee-jerking into the quick reactions and instead focusing on the root cause of what went wrong, so you can best develop those resources to ensure it doesn't happen again in the future. Kind of in line with that then is just simply being thorough. And that's where I'll work on getting that worksheet together. But part of that will just be making sure you're paying attention to all the different resource types instead of just the ones that might more immediately come to mind. And again, focusing on those three questions I've mentioned a couple times for what went right, what went wrong, how do we do better next time? So something, and this is where a lot of teams put a lot of focus, is they mostly focus on what went wrong. But make sure you're putting the time and effort into identifying what went right during the competition, because it's hard to be only critical about your performance, but it's nice to focus on what went right, because as I've talked about, it's important to maintain the resources that have gotten you to where you are. And if you're not identifying resources that have helped you to get where you're at and actively maintain those resources, you're doing yourself a bit of disservice, because that resource might not feel appreciated or might wind up walking away just because they weren't appreciated for their input in your team's process. So make sure you're focused on what went right and appreciating the resources that allowed those things to allowed and contributed to those things going right. What went wrong, again, just be crucial, be honest, and be thorough, and get down to those root causes instead of just what's immediately coming to mind. And how do we do it better next time? And this is where documentation is huge. You got to write these things down, get them on a Google Doc. I don't care, but getting them down on paper, having to sit down with your team's leadership or your team as a whole, and getting these things documented is incredibly helpful, because when it comes around to the next season and these things aren't as immediately on your mind, you can look back at these documents and say, hey, remember when we decided we shouldn't be doing this because X, Y, and Z reasons? You have some documentation to go back to, and it's incredibly helpful for the continuity of that process. And making sure, again, you're not repeatedly making decisions that are causing your team some struggles. So, all right. So what's next? We're talking about again being intentional. Make a plan. Figure out with your team when you can go about auditing your resources. This is something you can make some notes about yourself as well, instead of having a thorough team meeting right away. But that'll allow you to come more prepared to that meeting or that situation where you are discussing your team's resources. But work with your team's leadership to have a discussion about where your team's resources are at and how they're affecting your team's abilities to reach its goals. And again, make sure you're getting it down on paper. Make sure you're talking with your team. And again, this is where communication's so huge. If you're only communicating with 1 or 2 team members at a time, it's not the most efficient thing. So look into some communication programs or resources that'll allow you to more easily communicate with your team. So you're talking about things like Slack or Discord or other group me or other messaging apps that'll allow your team to better communicate. Because again, that's one of the resources to be developing along the way. And again, say thank you to existing resources. Some great examples of this are, at least from our experience on 1746, is just we'll wind up bringing a robot around to, and this is just one facet of saying thank you. There's obviously plenty of other types of resources to appreciate, but we'll wind up going around to a lot of the companies that wind up. We have some sponsorship levels on our team, but one of the ones I enjoy most because there's such a visual connection to the robot is the manufacturing in-kind sponsors that we have for our robot, for our sheet metal sponsors, or again, like Automation Direct, because not only do you get to connect with like the decision maker who's like funneling resources towards your team, but you're making connections then with the people working at those companies, and it's always awesome to see their eyes light up to say, hey, that's something we made, or you're using our parts on your robot. And that really generates a lot of excitement around what your team is doing, both as a program as well as the impact you're having on the community. But it also opens some interesting new doors for new potential resources so if you run into the right person at the right sponsor, they might get on the hook and might decide to mentor your team. But so again, talking about it earlier, is if you get the ball rolling on developing excitement around your program, and get that progress building upon itself, you'd be pretty surprised at the resources that wind up almost unintentionally finding you. Obviously, there's a lot of intent you got to have for like going on Google and looking up manufacturing resources. But every now and then there are some resources that'll surprise you for popping out of nowhere. But yeah, the more you make those interactions possible, the more you open yourself up to those resources showing up. So make sure you're thanking existing resources and appreciating them, because you never know what kind of benefit that's going to produce in the future. And again, that rolls into kind of just ask to developing. So having your team's kind of ideas on what resources you want to develop is one thing. But once somebody on your team decides, hey, we really want to look into sheet metal, start looking up local resources. Something that'll kind of may inform your teams what resources might be available is that when you go to Google search sheet metal manufacturers and you don't find any, maybe you'll find some other manufacturing resources that'll again extend your team's design capabilities in a different direction. But again, you got to work with the resources available to you, and play with what you got, but always keep looking for specific things. Another fun one here is we had a mentor down at Georgia Tech who had but simply had a roommate who was had an internship at a company nearby where our team was located, and just kept feeding him bits and pieces of, hey, check out this FRC team, look at all this cool stuff we're doing. But this wound up leading us to not only gaining a substantial sponsor, awesome company named Solvay, but then that roommate then went on to mentor our team as well as provide us with some just amazing resources for new, some in-kind sponsorships for a variety of plastic materials that we're able to play with. A resource I'm a huge fan of here on Team Auto is we wind up using a lot of polycarbonate, but we have a local supplier that will usually buy a huge 4x8 sheet polycarb from. But something simply just from asking after picking up the polycarb sheet, I'd noticed a bunch of scrap bins that they had sitting over by their huge shears, because they're a lot of the times not focusing on little customers that are just buying a sheet or two at a time, but they're working on volume orders. But the scraps from that process just wind up getting tossed in a cardboard box for recycling. That simply by asking, I wound up being able to have access to a whole new resource that we wouldn't have had available to us by being able to kind of raid their scrap bin. So yeah, just asking can get you quite a ways. So it's hard to fill a need if you're not making that need known. That kind of fills in with things like getting parents involved. So if you can say, hey, we're either looking for somebody to help out with providing meals for the teams during meetings, but as well as things as, hey, we're short on mentors in this area. Do you know anybody with this skill set that you could get involved? That there's a huge opportunity to get people involved simply by asking and making sure that the need is known. So that'll one of the best ways to build out your resources. We'll move on here. And this is my last slide here, but just some links to some existing resources, some recommended presentations. Again, having started all the way back in 2005 doing FRC, I've been able to see quite a few things and learn quite a bit along the way. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, it's all about so much of it's about standing on the shoulders of giants, because again, this presentation wouldn't be happening if it weren't for so many awesome resources that are available in the FRC community. So some of those talks, and I think Detroit 2019 is probably the most recent one for Karthik giving his awesome talk on effective first strategies. And again, that's really hinting at knowing how to use your resources. And again, there's so much complementary puzzle pieces that you really need to focus on building out all of that whole skill set. So make sure you're watching these presentations, because these are crucial. Because you'll see teams out there that have endless resources, either monetary or manufacturing or fabrication equipment, that have no idea how to use them. That you'll and this leads to one of my favorite parts about FRC is that, and this may have been easier back in the day for the 2005 era when COTS parts weren't quite as available, is that you'd have teams working out of like a parent's garage with minimal resources for a chop saw and a drill press or drills, and minimal access, minimal monetary funds, but just enough know-how or the ability to use the resources they have that they can go head to head with the best teams in the world. So that's one of my favorite parts about explaining FRC to people, is it's about knowing how to use the resources you have and seeing those teams compete head to head with some of the teams that know how to perfectly use their resources and have unlimited amounts of them. But yeah, given the right resources and the right know-how, you can really play to a pretty high ceiling. Second up on the list is then Michael Corsetto for a goal setting presentation. I had watched a couple times that he'd given a Capital City Classic, I believe, was where the presentation came from. but a seminar that he had given on how your team can go about setting its goals effectively. So again, another one of those substantial puzzle pieces. And another resource I had found just while looking around, I don't recall seeing this when it initially came out. And this kind of feeds into the just ask question, is just search and you will find kind of thing. That you'll find some amazing resources out there developed by some of the best people in FRC. So there's an awesome resource that was part of a behind the lines production back in 2016 for a few folks discussing how to go about improving your team. That really fits in well with that goal setting and effective strategies conversation. So I've got there's a video presentation as well as a link to the PowerPoint presentation for that specific presentation. But that's all I have on auditing your team's resources. I hope this has been helpful for the teams watching. But awesome to have you, and I hope your teams do some awesome things going forward. But thanks again.
Thank you so much, Kellen. We actually have a couple of questions for you.
Oh, shoot.
Yeah, that was a great presentation. So the first one we have from Nico is,
could you mind turning off your screen share just so I could present your faces?
Oh yeah, sorry.
You make it.
Oh, there we go. Found it.
Awesome, great. I can see you full screen now.
Okay.
So Nico asked this, and are there any particular programs, methods you'd recommend to help with material resource audits? Like, how do you keep a track of all your physical stuff?
That's something we have issues with ourselves. Some things are fast enough moving. It's hard to keep like updated inventory lists and things like that. But something, at least the thing most specifically I can imagine immediately is our use of just a Google Sheet. That's a part of our team's Google Drive to link and track what existing, or what are all of our electronics components, because obviously a lot of money goes into your team's electronics for Robo Rios, speed controllers, that kind of thing. So we have a running spreadsheet of how many of them we have, where they're located, if they're on an existing robot. So it'll kind of inform whether we need to kind of vulture a specific robot for certain components instead of buying new ones. But yeah, running spreadsheets. I don't know if I've heard of a couple teams before that'll have legitimate like barcoding systems. They can like scan out parts that whenever you're using them, you have to identify that, hey, this is being used, so that your team's purchasers can keep tabs on what stock you might have left. But yeah, that's knowing your resources is like your capabilities is one thing, but yeah, knowing your physical resources is also a huge part of it. But yeah,
that makes sense. On that same note, how about for time, right? Because I guess time is much harder to quantify, but like, are there any recommendations you have for how you can like analyze that?
I'd build a lot of it off of your track record. So it's hard to kind of compare to other teams. But I'll talk about this in a couple senses. There might be some like actual project management tools that you can develop. And again, this can be as simple as like a Google Sheet, just tracking what projects your team's currently working on. But there are then project management tools out there like Trello. I'm sure there are plenty of others that allow your team to kind of track what progress is being made. If you're not familiar with what Gantt charts are, those can be incredibly helpful because you're kind of figuring out where bottlenecks are before they happen by saying, all right, we need to complete this job before we move on to this job, but can also help you identify kind of parallel processing in that you're working on two things at the same time instead of, because that's one of my most frustrating moments for seeing students sitting around is you should never be waiting. There's always something else to be working on. So utilizing time is important, but I think the other thing there, again, based off of your team's track record, so pay attention to like, and I guess it gets more difficult when things change so substantially that you're not dealing with a bag and tag anymore. But what our team did this last year, regardless of bag and tag leaving, is we tried keeping the same schedule we had for the prior season to make sure we were getting done in 6 weeks, that they would be more ready for our first event. So a lot of it's about keeping tabs on where your team currently is at, or what your track record is, such that you can kind of improve upon past results.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, I think I heard a lot of teams trying to keep with their 6-week schedule because like they had no other context for doing this, right, without bag and tag. So I think that was one way teams tried to handle that this year. But that's a very good point. So this is actually a question I had. So how do you go about like assessing where you need to get mentors from, and like I guess like what you need to be mentored in, right? Because sometimes like you can get like a couple of mentors who help in like a particular area, but it's harder to pull mentors in from like, like if you need business help, for example, or like just like in targeted areas. Do you have any recommendations for that?
Again, I'd focus on making the need known. So based on your current network, you can express that need based, again, your team parents, your team's current sponsors. You might be able to, whenever you're interacting with that sponsor, to say, hey, and a lot of it depends on the sponsor type. So if you have a company that's donating in kind, but might do like a software, it's hard to ask them for somebody that might be mechanically minded to help you design or help with CADing your robot or something like that. So you kind of have to have targeted messages. But just like you'd go out and look for a sheet metal sponsor, you might do the same thing for approaching any manufacturing companies, to approach them and say, hey, obviously you guys produce or are manufacturing products, but at this, I'm sure you have somebody back or in your office somewhere working on the actual designs for those products. And we'd be curious if you'd have any insights. But what I'd focus on in that situation is just worry about getting them on the hook. Don't worry about trying to get a full-blown mentor right away. Get them on the hook and just get them in the door. Show them all the cool things you're working on. That's one of the better ways to keep them around, instead of saying, hey, we're looking for somebody that can contribute 10 to 20 hours a week. But yeah, so don't throw them in the deep end right away. But to that end, I'd also recommend making sure you're allowing mentors to kind of contribute as they want to contribute, as weird as that sounds, because again, that really helps keep them around, because you're keeping them actively and mentally engaged in what they're working on, and instead of trying to force them into a specific subsection of your team. But yeah, just some ideas.
That's some amazing advice. Pauline actually had this question. So does your team have like a standard elevator pitch for when you are approaching new vendors or resources or sponsors? Because you're talking about making your need known. So is this something that like your team kind of gets together, like when you're assessing resources and you're trying to figure out, okay, these are the things, and this is how we're going to try to pitch it? Or is it like, I guess, more organic?
Well, so we'll have a bit of a like boilerplate template for approaching certain sponsors. And this is where I have to keep some tabs on what our business team's up to, because every now and then they'll try to approach sponsors that might be perfect in contributing like in-kind materials, but that might not be what's kind of emphasized in the presentation. So you kind of got to play to your sponsor to some degree. Obviously, there are plenty of talking points that can be pretty consistent across the board, but otherwise you need to tailor it a bit, especially if you're like going after a sponsor for a very specific reason. There are points you want to hit on. So put yourself in their shoes and say, like, why would you want to help us out? A lot of teams like think of it as a back and forth transaction. Like, all right, I'm giving you, or if I'm as a sponsor giving you resources, are you then, what am I getting out of this in return, kind of thing. But a lot of the sponsors, more often than not, they're a lot of them don't care so much about having their name on the robot, as awesome as it is, because that's one of the things they can see when they come to your shop. They'll be like, oh, that's our company on your robot. But they love to see the excitement, the enthusiasm of especially if you can get them to an event. They love to see the excitement, the enthusiasm on your team's faces, and the things that your team's actually learning from the process. So if you can if you can ever arrange tours and things like that at your team sponsors, regardless of how connected or disconnected it might be immediately from STEM, it allows for an awesome interaction between teams and sponsors, to be able to interact with the students they're impacting based on their support.
That makes sense. And I think this is the last question I have for you before we let you go for the night.
Yeah.
So this is kind of a two-parter from Jared and Nico. So one is like, how often do you think it's important to like reassess what, you know, the resources your team has? Like, is it, you know, once a year? Is it like every 4 years when you get like a completely new group of students? Is it something that you just do continuously? And a second part of that is, I guess like on the note of like, you know, taking time to try to figure out what you have. How important is it to dedicate some time to the entire team to step back and just, you know, take a break before they, you know, try to go back to approach things?
Yeah, no, burnout is certainly a thing.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so talking about frequency, you can do it to a varying degree. I'd have a somewhat serious conversation about it. Depending on your team situation, it might not be one of the 4 things at the forefront, depending on how quickly you're developing as a team, or if you're a bit maintaining status quo. But to that end, you might also just be, if you're coming back to it on a yearly basis, you might just be updating it from last year, but on like a 4-year cycle, as I think the interval was mentioned, that you might want to do a more drastic conversation about it instead of having a full-fledged bottom to top conversation about it every single year. But yeah, it's something to keep your eye on throughout the year. Again, with it being so hand in hand with goal setting, they factor into each other the bit there, because obviously if your team's goals are out of line with what resources you have or what resources you're trying to develop, it doesn't make too much sense. So make sure you're doing those things hand in hand.
So it sounds like it's probably a good idea to, like, if you reach a certain goal, right, you kind of like go back and look at your resources and you look at that there. Or if you're like struggling to, you know, make a goal, right, or like reach that goal, you go back to the drawing board as well.
Yeah. So yeah, depending. So like if you've set a list of 10 goals and you should reach all of them before expected or when as expected, then you go back to the drawing table and say, all right, where are we reaching to next? What do we want to accomplish next? And what resources are those going to require? So that kind of feeds into the kind of as needed kind of thing. So yeah, because I can see the conversation happening after a competition season that you're just doing goal setting for just the off season, and then kind of reestablishing new goals come just before the build season for what your competitive goals might be. So yeah. But remind me the second part of the question then. For
I guess it's like I'm trying to think of like the right word for the opposite of burnout, right? Because I think that's like a resource too. Like, how's that something that you manage? Anti-burnout, what's the word for that? Motivation? I don't know. But it's like a tangible thing that like I think a lot of teams struggle a lot with, especially teams who try to set aggressive goals.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it's important to, because it's easy to identify, I think, those particular stressful moments to say like, all right, we're pushing ourselves harder than we're mentally capable of right now. But yeah, it's always important to identify when you're kind of hitting those limits and being able to take some time and step back. But that's such a huge reason why, again, another resource we're talking about here is your depth as a student group or as a team. Is it more effectively allows you to spread that burden. So instead of, so if you're noticing like a particular person on your team is burning out, get that person some help, train some other team members to lighten the load on that person. So that'll allow you to kind of pull some of the burden off, but at the same time, so you might have these conversations about auditing your resources right after the competition season, but depending on what your team's goals are, if you're almost immediately pursuing like off-season competitions right after that, or developing a new drivetrain or something like that in the off-season, yeah, it can be very helpful to take a bit of time off. And that can be almost more of a personal thing instead of a team structure thing. But make sure you're taking care of those mental capacities. And I think there's some later presentations. I don't know if there were any earlier tonight on just keeping track of that mental health.
Yeah, actually, that's a workshop and panel that's coming up on Saturday night. So that's actually a perfect segue, Kellen. Thank you so much for that. That is just to kind of talk about that briefly. That is 6 p.m. to 6:40 p.m. PST. That's a panel on promoting positive mental health culture in FRC, or that's a workshop, sorry. And from 6:50 to 7:30 p.m. PST, we have a panel on that same topic with some really incredible people. We have Frank Merrick on that panel. We have Christine from 125, and we have Livy from 1678, as well as PJ moderating. So that's going to be a lot of fun.
Highly recommend.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kellen. It was really great listening to you today. I think we all learned a lot for this. And thank you so much for helping us with Beach Blitz.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, have a good night.
Yeah, you too.